Hello and welcome to the SDRealness podcast brought to you by Sales Development Revolution, where we're talking with practitioners in the space about important topics to them. I'm Alex Ellison, here as always with my co-host, Grayson Fulbright.
Hello and good morning or evening, everybody.
So this season's theme for the podcast is see action, take action. Our goal is to dive into a specific topic about sales development and learn, those specific tactics from experts who do it every day. Today's topic is on creating and managing sales cadences. Joining to discuss this with us is Rory Caulfield. He's currently a commercial account executive at Datadog. But more importantly, Rory, you're really one of my first mentors when I started as an SDR over at DemandDrive. So I'm so glad you could hop on with us today.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. My ego's definitely doubled.
Awesome. So to kick things off, Rory, I really wanted to go into the very beginning of this conversation about sales cadences, what they are, why they're important, and how you actually get started and prepare to use them. So one, I wanted to just get like a quick vibe from you on, why should reps and why should SDR specifically be seeing their activities and their week-to-week workflow more as a journey and a cadence rather than just individual touches? And then from that, could you give us like a quick walkthrough of how you or your team members both prep and then also create those cadences?
Yeah, so I think with cadences, I like to think of it as like kind of the backbone of like organizing your day to day and like how you go about your account list or whatever. So that can really kind of come into a couple of buckets. The way that I like to think about it is, and this has been really helpful for me as like a rep, is really kind of bucketing down like your accounts through different kinds of priorities. So whether that's like you have top 10 strategic accounts that are a little bit more on like the customized outreach, but then you also want to keep in mind that there's those smaller, more transactional accounts that you want to cycle through and have those sprints. So just making sure that like you're like, I put my calendar to have all of my like outbound activity to be aligned to whatever sprint group I'd be working or anything like that. So it really just keeps, reps accountable. And especially just like throughout the process, because you obviously want to make sure that you're cycling through as many contacts and so forth with that cadence, and it gives you kind of a good pulse on like where they are in the buying process, especially as you start to kind of like highlight the rest of that cadence. So do you want me to just kind of dive into like first touch and all of that, or is there specific examples that you'd want to cover on that side of it?
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll get into kind of the first touch versus follow-up touch soon, but I'm really interested in what you mentioned about the fact that you have these accounts and not all of them are the same. And what that implicitly means is, unless necessary, they shouldn't have the same cadence either. It should be customized to that specific buying group. So I wanted to kind of follow up and just ask, what do you do to actually look at your accounts, kind of organize and map them out, and then decide kind of how you should play a cadence? So what's the difference between like a VIP account versus a more transactional deal? How would those cadences differ?
Of course. Obviously it depends on like the tech vertical you're in and like the personas you're reaching out to. Like that cadence can kind of be different, right? Because there's certain tech verticals like information security where it's high touch points and just like low connect rates. Whereas you're reaching out to someone in like HR tech, obviously the connect rates are going to be a little bit higher. So, since I'm reaching out to typically like IT, DevOps engineers, obviously like we've seen more on the side of like, you can get them on the phone for sure, but there's definitely a lot of tailored messaging that comes with it. So for me, it could be like someone's GitHub profile, or if you're going on Crunchbase to look at their accounts, right? So really like looking at revenue, like fast growth or anything like that, and just using sales nabs. So, I think company to company, like, depending on where you're representing the sales for, it really kind of just there's ways to kind of like allocate like resources and how you want to go about the cadence to really make sure that it's really in line with like the vertical that you're reaching out to and the people that you're eventually going to put into the purchasing process.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, really, when you think about it. You don't want to spend too much time reaching out to, even if it's like, right, you have a great conversation, the guy seems like an awesome dude on the other side or something like that. At the end of the day, the sale, if it's going to be smaller, you can't really spend that much time on it, because that's not how you're going to, grow the company, and make the commission that you probably want on top of that. So Yeah, I think it goes back into that sort of bucketing that we've talked about in past episodes and things like that. But I think that's a good point. If you really look at, Crunchbase and really take the time to do the research, that's so important. You'll be able to figure out which bucket it goes into and reach out that way. So it's great advice there. I do now sort of want to get into that first touch you were talking about, because it is such an important part of the cadence and just of the SDR role as a whole. A bad first touch, bad email, you're screwed. There's nothing you can do to overcome from that sometimes. But on the flip side, if you send a good first touch, a lot of prospects will notice it and go, okay, I see what you're doing there, and then wait for the next touch, which is, another thing we can get into in a bit. But I just want to dive into sort of your thought process on first touches, what you do for them. Do you have any good advice or good examples of successful first touches that you've used in the past or tend to use a lot?
Actually, it's a funny story because lately I've been using this template and I call it the Nicolas Cage template. And ironically, I'm not even a fan of Nicolas Cage movies at all. So this is just to give you a breakdown. One of the companies I was reaching out to, I couldn't really find any good trigger events to kind of reference, even with the person's profile. Because even if like they had like a certain like alma mater or hobby, I'd try to reference it just so that like they know that I'm reaching out to them as a person. But this time I couldn't find anything. And so I went on the company's blog and it looks like, okay, so they had some funny story about ordering the same Nicolas Cage pillow in their office or something. It was weird because, but like the way that I like broke down that email was like, okay, so noticed blank, right? Just make anything very specific to that person. And then you have that tailored, that aside, like I'm reaching out because of these XYZ initiatives. Here's what we do. Want to have a conversation to see if this is somewhat similar. What do you think? Very simple, but I think that kind of gives you like that idea of like, yes, you could tailor the message within that first outreach, but then you don't have to do it like first touch template to first touch template. You can make it more operationalized so that like you're still hitting your metrics and then you're increasing the conversion rates with your outreach and everything like that as well.
Yeah, and I like that because you dive the part that's not personalized, you still make sure is relevant, right? It's not just like, hey, Nicolas Cage pillow, can I take a call, right? You're not just doing the personalization. You're also taking the time to like, the template below it is really what you want to get across. You're just making that warm intro to then sort of segue into what you think is going to be relevant for them and actually pique their interest in a business sense, right?
Absolutely. And I think the one thing that I like to use too is that like, I know we talked about this before, but like having, I don't like use I use really weird names for my email templates. Like I don't do like first touch this. It's like Alex Ellison 2020 email or something. Like anytime I go like a rep will share like a certain body or a certain hook of an email, like I just like have that in my mind. So like I'll pull in like maybe a call to action like from someone else's email, but then a body of like the product picture, whatever, from another. So I think like once you, and especially like as you get more comfortable in the seat and everything like that, you start to kind of like piece together. So whether like, depending on like how you kind of learn, I have a very odd process of how I go about templates, clearly, if I'm naming them after actors, Mike. But it just goes to show that like you have, like there's different ways of being creative where you can automate the outreach process, especially with email, and not make it such a time suck out of your day. Because I know I see it myself sometimes too, where it's like I spend an hour, and if not having that operationalized like way of going about your templates or how you collaborate with them could really kind of just take time away from other value-added activities for sure.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think you touched on two really important things here. One, like the first touch is not only the first impression, but it really sets the stage for the rest of your cadence. As Alex mentioned, one bad touch can really kill that relationship and make it hard to repair later on. And so it makes sense, and it's valuable for SDRs to spend a little bit of more time on that initial touch so you can have some clout and look like you did your research. But on the same side, another really good point that you made is it still needs to be repeatable and it still needs to be operationalized so that it's not just overbearing. I think I personally use this type of format for outreach often, where it's like, it doesn't make sense to personalize every line of an email or a script. So just personalize the first bit so that they know instantly that you're a human, and then you can move on to start engaging them on something more relevant. And so I think that's something that I think people need to understand when it comes to managing cadences is, you need to put enough personalization and enough research into it so that it's relevant. But it still needs to be designed in a way that you're allowed to hit metrics. Because Rory made a good point that, personalization is great, but it can definitely impact the amount of volume you can put out, sometimes in such a way that even the higher conversion rates don't offset and you still don't hit quota. And so it's something that I think people need to be careful about as they kind of go into building out a cadence.
Absolutely. I was just gonna add, I mean, if you do mess up with like maybe like a little first touch template, like I've gotten a meeting once where it was like I had the wrong name of the CTO, and then I literally bumped the email right there, put a star, and I was like, oh, sorry, Stuart. Please don't. If this is the reason why we part ways, and I understand. But got a meeting out of it. I'm not saying do that all the time, but like, you do mess up with the first touch and you like see it right after you send it, you're like, what do I do? Just bump it and see.
Yeah, and I think that emphasizes the importance of journey too, because I mean, like, even if they are mistakes can humanize you, and that can be kind of part of the story that you construct for them. I know of a strategy for a follow-up email, like a second touch email that I believe worked last year, but it's already kind of fizzled out and become too popular. But it was essentially sending an email, and then within like the first hour or two, immediately following up, basically forgetting to mention something. So it kind of brings about that, like, oops, I'm a human, oops, I'm making a mistake, but it's still really engaging. And at the time, we got a ton of responses just from that second follow-up email. But I want to kind of go beyond the first touch and really talk about the kind of follow-up and additional journey from your perspective, Rory. What does a second touch look like versus a third touch? And really, how do you think the cadence needs to change as you gather more information? So whether someone is more or less engaged as they kind of go through the cadence.
Absolutely. So first off, as long as the email doesn't bounce from the first touch, right? Like, we're good to go. And then we got that going. So with the bumps, and it's funny because I've definitely taken more of a different approach than I did at Demand Drive or at prior companies going into Datadog, because I noticed that there's been a lot of success doing like bumping the same email on the same thread sometimes. But I'm trying to get better about like making sure that, okay, if they haven't read this thread for 5 emails straight, maybe like change that up a little bit, right? So the bump, I always think of them as bumps, follow-ups, whatever. But if you can find like a quick 2-minute overview of what your company does in a video, that's great. Like being like, hey, I thought this simplifying this would help you determine if we're a fit. Here's what we do. Let me know what you think. Or if you have like online sessions that are coming up, hey, here's an online session we're hosting each week. Like, I mean, depending on like how like the marketing events kind of go about with like the prospects I'm selling from. But in terms of that, I think there's a lot of different content you can leverage. One thing I actually do like to do a lot is kind of keep bump emails specific to the day of the week. So like if it's a Friday email, or if it's like one right before like a 3-day weekend, just kind of making it tailored in that, like, hey, like I know we're out of the office this weekend, just wanted to finalize my calendar. I think there's a good way about that. My personal favorite is if I know I'm going to be out of vacation, I'll pretend like I'm some sort of celebrity, and I'm like, well, I'm out of the office, but if you want to get back to me, I'm finalizing calendars. I mean, it works. I think that there's ways to be creative about it, and ensuring that like it's still keeping yourself accountable to the fact that if they're not opening up the emails, then you want to change it up. And I think one thing that I'm always trying to get better at is like checking the open rates with some of these emails, because whether you're using like a Groove or a Yesware or whatever, like, I mean, if you're like wasting all this time and not really noticing that this email doesn't even like has not been opened whatsoever, or they maybe have a second email that they use for the company, like there's so many different variables that can happen. So I think just keeping an eye on like the traction that you're getting with the cadence, and then understanding like, okay, maybe at that point, do you want to like nurture it for 3 weeks and then send a breakup email, or is the account even worth going after at that point, right? So I think there's I think towards like that bump, like my goal with the bump of the cadence is that like I want to make sure that like I'm at least getting an answer, like connecting with anyone from the company, right? Whether it's we're not interested, not right person, whatever. Like if I can get some piece of information or some initiative that might be valuable to what of our value drivers are, then I think that that's really kind of how I like to think about the goal of like what you want to achieve out of those bump emails, other than getting a meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good call out. I love that you mentioned kind of like proactively looking at engagement metrics as the cadence goes along, because I've always seen sales cadences as something that's dynamic, where you kind of have this layer at the bottom that's automated, and it's assuming that they literally go through the whole thing and don't respond. But then on top of that, you should have reps or marketing teams going and looking at when people open emails, when people connect with the brand page, when people visit their website, and then start customizing the activities that an SDR does based on that. And that's the kind of the whole thing behind lead scoring. That's the intention anyway, is to kind of get a sky view understanding of where an SDR should be focusing their time as people go through the journey. Because even if you're not using a sales cadence, there are people and companies that are qualified that have found you via inbound or found you via social, or maybe like unsubscribed to you 2 years ago, but now they're back on the map and looking you up. And there's so many journeys that go on between a buyer and a seller from beginning to end. And really all a sales cadence is trying to give an SDR and the sales team a little bit more control over kind of A, discovering where they're at, and B, influencing the direction of where they're going. And so I think this advice is really beautiful. And one thing I wanted to kind of touch on is like, what in your mind is the difference between like a cadence to try to actually generate a conversation and catch their attention versus maybe some later steps that's more for like kind of nurturing and just relationship building? Because I'm sure, as you get to, step 10, 11, 12, you probably change your stance a little bit and kind of like focus on different goals. So what does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, I always create a folder called circling back, breakup, or kind of nurture emails, right? And that like could really, I think there's like an overlap with like what you can put in like under a nurture template, and like one that's like a bump for like for kind of in that first round of cadence, where there's like just content driven stuff. So like if you have launched a new integration that you didn't have before, or something like that, like that's something to leverage in the circling back kind of bucket as well. But also just like we're in Q4, so like I love like setting in those end of Q4, like, or like going into Q4, like typically we see organizations try to cut costs, streamline efficiencies, whatever it is, right? Reduce risk, whatever. Like is like having like that kind of be part of the journey, because I see a lot of success more so on the circling back side, knowing that the person's like looked at the email or what have you, and then trying to translate that into kind of like, gauging where they're at now, right? I think, and also I think with like the cool thing about if you were to kind of like do like a second sprint of this account and you're kind of like running like out of contacts, if you find a new hire, like I always like to just like map out like, here's how I'm thinking of this organization. Like this person oversees this. Can you help me out here? Because circling back emails don't necessarily have to be the goal of like, let's get a meeting, because if you can't, depending on like how complicated the sales cycle is for the relative product you're probably selling into, it could really just kind of depend on, just getting like those open-ended questions answered to get your foot in the door, right? Whereas maybe if you're more on the transactional sales side, then yeah, like obviously it's just kind of like getting like yes or no, and then kind of like, do I want to spend more time like circling back on this, or do I want to kind of backfill that account and put another one in there and to build that contact out for future outreach?
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense as far as, excuse me, as far as really just understanding, right? A lot of what we've talked about, you really need to understand the prospect, and I think you do a great job of that, of knowing sort of what you think their goals are, right? If it's transactional, sort of by doing all your research and then tailoring the cadence to that. But then on top of that, being able to do that at scale in a way that you can do this and still hit sort of the volume numbers that you want to do. So yeah, it's been great talking to you about that. There's one thing before we wrap up here, I know we just have a couple minutes, I want to point out that you said and sort of what it does. And I really liked when you said, if you're going on vacation, you act like a celebrity, right? And I think that's something that I think you've always done a really good job of, is your own importance as an SDR. I think this isn't really related to cadences, but it's an important point. I think a lot of SDRs, especially if you're new in the role, you're like, oh, I'm just like the entry-level sales guy. I just like pass leads. I don't really know anything. It's a lot of SDRs don't really have that, I guess, self-confidence to be able to say like, hey, it's my job to get this meeting with you. I know it's important and I think it can help you. Let's have a conversation about it. So, and one story I just have to share from our days together just comes to mind. You were always great at, you would call someone at like 9:57 or like right before the top of the hour. And if they pick up, they'll go, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just running to a meeting," or "I thought this was me dialing into the meeting." And you see, and they're lying, and your response was always, "Oh, me too. I just wanted to get one last call in before I hop into a meeting." And it totally just like, I guess, destabilized their comp. They were like, "Oh, what do I do?" And then it gives you the open to sort of take control of the conversation with that confidence that you're bringing to the call. So
100%. Because you can translate that into your cadences. I mean, I think that there's an alignment there, because I think that like there's one way to like have that bravado over the phone for sure, and like, you know, be empowered as like an SDR, and then also just like putting that in your messaging sometimes. Like, look, Mr. CTO or whatever, like you're probably getting bombarded a lot, because if it's like a company that just got funding, like I'm sure every SDR in the world is like hitting them up, right? So it's like just calling it out, like, hey, like, yeah, because like you got to think of it like how many reps are reaching out to the same account, right? Like across a bunch of different vendors, right? Not just like the one vertical you're supporting. So like you got to stand out, right? So I think that's definitely a way to kind of like leverage that into your like day to day on the email side.
100%. Yeah, definitely something good I learned from you there back in the day. Rory, thank you so much for joining us today. Always good catching up. And I really love this conversation we had about outreach cadences and really about SDR work as a whole. If people want to find out either more about you or more about Datadog, where can they go to do that?
Well, my Instagram's Rory Eats. No, I'm not trying to be famous. Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I have a Twitter, but it's not that exciting. I just post about tech stuff like very instantly, so there's nothing juicy out there. But yeah, you can follow me there.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This has been Alex and Grayson for the SDRealness podcast. Until next time, SDRs, keep it real.
Thanks, guys.